a prodigy, an artistic genius who lived poorly and lonely in wealth. Today, we are talking about Michelangelo. Before I talk about his personal life, his career, and his art, I'm taking you to 1475, the year Michelangelo was born in. 35 years after goldsmith Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, in 1475 there were two important things about books. Recueil of the Histories of Troy is the first book to be printed in English by William Caxton in Bruges. Rashi's commentary on the Torah is the first dated book to be printed in Hebrew. The Battle of Vaslui between Moldavian and Ottomans ended this year. Stefan III of Moldavia defeats the Ottoman Empire, which is led at this time by Mehmed the Conqueror of Istanbul. On March 6, 1475, Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, or with the name that we know, Michelangelo, was born. He was an Italian sculptor, painter, architect, and poet of the High Renaissance. He was born in Caprese, a small town situated in Valtellerina near Arezzo, Tuscany. For several generations, his family had been small-scale bankers in Florence. At the time of Michelangelo's birth, his father was the town's judicial administrator. Michelangelo's mother was Francesca di Neri del Miniato di Siena. Several months after Michelangelo's birth, the family returned to Florence, where she was raised. During his mother's later prolonged illness and after her death in 1481, when Michelangelo was only 6 years old, he lived with his wet nurse and nanny and her husband. His nanny's husband was a stonecutter in the town of Settignano, where his father owned a marble quarry and a small farm. There, he gained his love for marble. Michelangelo was going to joke about this later, saying that he observed this talent of sculpture through the milk of his wet nurse, because she was coming from a family of stonemasons. Throughout his life, Michelangelo felt deeply ashamed of his family's disgraceful decline and his father's irresponsibility and their modest past. He was often forced to help his father financially throughout his life. He only kept a close relationship with his younger brother, Buonarroti. In 1488, as a young boy, Michelangelo was sent to Florence to study grammar under the humanist Francesco de Urbino. However, he showed no interest in his schooling, preferring to copy paintings from churches and hang out with other painters. In 1488, at the age of 13, Michelangelo was apprenticed to Ghirlandaio. But he did not get along well with him and was going to leave him in 1489 to go to the sculpture school of Bertoldo di Giovanni, a student of Donatello and an influential friend and art curator for Lorenzo de' Medici the Magnificent. Lorenzo de' Medici was impressed by Michelangelo so much, and he was going to raise him with his own family. From 1490 to 1492, Michelangelo attended the Platonic Academy, founded by the Medici. There, his work and outlook were influenced by many of the most prominent philosophers and writers of the day. At this time, Michelangelo sculpted the reliefs Madonna of the Stairs between 1490 and 92 and Battle of Centaurs 1491 and 92. Lorenzo Medici's sudden death in 1492 reversed the situation for Michelangelo. He had to leave Medici's court and he went back to his father's house. In the following months, he was going to carve the wooden sculpture crucifix. This was a gift for a prior of the Florentine church, because this church was allowing him to come to the church's hospital and look at corpses and study those dead bodies so that he can learn more about anatomy, human anatomy. just like Da Vinci did around those times. Lorenzo's successor, Piero de' Medici, called Michelangelo back to the country. So he went back and he started working on large pieces of marble. According to the biographer Condivi, Lorenzo Medici, for whom Michelangelo had sculpted St. John the Baptist, asked that Michelangelo fix it so that it looked as if it had been buried, so he could send it Rome to pass it off as an ancient work and sell it much better. So both Lorenzo and Michelangelo were unwittingly cheated out of the real value of the piece by a middleman. So Cardinal Rafael Riario, to whom Lorenzo had sold this piece, discovered that it was a fraud. But he was so impressed by the quality of the sculpture that he invited the artist to Rome. Michelangelo arrived in Rome on 25th of June 1496 at the age of 21. On the July 4th of the same year, he began working on a commission for Cardinal Riario, an over life-size statue of the Roman wine god Bacchus. The statue was an incredibly sensuous piece and an accomplished work for a 21-year-old artist, a masterpiece in classical style. In November 1497, the French ambassador to the Holy See, Cardinal Jean de Bilheres Lagroulas, commissioned him to carve a Pieta, a sculpture showing the Virgin Mary grieving over the body of Jesus. He was 24 at the time of its completion. It was soon to be regarded as one of the world's greatest masterpieces of sculpture. I don't know if you know it, but Michelangelo actually never signs his work. But in this one, Michelangelo put his signature across the statue's chest after an admirer mistook it for another artist's work, and it remains his only signed piece. Michelangelo returned to Florence in 1499. Now he was commissioned by Medici to do another great project, a project that started 40 years ago. A sculpture that is a symbol of freedom of Florentine people. David. Different from his other works, in this one he had to work on an already used marble. So this was kind of a disadvantage for him. It took him 3 years to finish the statue of David. With his oversized feet and hands, his robust and muscular figure definitely was anti-classical. By 1504, now with David, Michelangelo showed people that he was a master with extraordinary skills. He was just 25 years old. This is when I was 25. And this is when Michelangelo was 25. The fame of the David spread quickly, and in 1505, Pope Julius II asked Michelangelo to come to Rome to design his tomb. The Tomb of Julius project, which was interrupted by the need for numerous redesigns and contract issues, took nearly 40 years to complete, and Michelangelo considered the project the tragedy of his career. Michelangelo began to suspect that Pope was giving preferential treatment to Bramante and artist Raphael, and in 1506, Michelangelo left Rome annoyed to return to Florence. According to Condivi's account, Bramante, who was working on the building of St. Peter's Basilica, resented Michelangelo's commission for the Pope's tomb, and according to, again, Condivi, he convinced the Pope to commission Michelangelo in a medium with which he was unfamiliar with, in order that he might fail at the task. Oh boy, he had no idea what he had done. In 1508, the Pope and Michelangelo stopped working on the tomb and began painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo, annoyed at the disruption, wanted to finish the difficult work of painting the enormous ceiling as quickly as possible. He finished in an amazing pace in just 4 years. The composition stretches over 500 square meters of ceiling and contains over 300 figures. There are 25 scenes describing the beginning of the world. Among the most famous paintings on the ceiling are the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the deluge, the prophet Jeremiah, and the Cumaean Sibyl. From 1513 to 1516, Michelangelo worked on carving the massive Moses figure for Julius' tomb, which was to become the centerpiece. He also began working on the statues of 2 slaves, although these were never finished and never actually became part of the finished tomb itself. The dying slave and the rebellious slave, while both unfinished, are elegant expressions of Michelangelo's obsession with the tense sensuality of the nude male figure and with the physical energy imprisoned within. The monumental Moses is one of the absolute high points of Michelangelo's sculptural career. It is the only figure in the finished project that was certainly executed by Michelangelo himself rather than his assistants. By 1520, Michelangelo was unquestionably the most famous and maybe the most successful artist, Italian artist, because his rivals Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci were already dead. In this year, Medici came back to Michelangelo with another project. This time it was going to be a funerary chapel in Basilica of San Lorenzo. Michelangelo did his own creation in Medici Chapel, and this chapel had tombs of 2 young members of this Medici family. Michelangelo worked on allegories of the phases of the day, 4 nudes representing dawn, day, evening, and night, until 1534. They are among Michelangelo's finest nudes and are excellent examples of his combining action with repose. Day and evening are male figures, the former robust and young, the latter aging and limp. Dawn and night, although female, are obviously based on male models who represented for Michelangelo the superior human form. In 1524, Michelangelo received an architectural commission from the Medici Pope for Laurentian Library at San Lorenzo's church. He designed both the interior of the library itself and its vestibule, a building utilizing architectural forms with such dynamic effect that it is seen in the forerunner of Baroque architecture. In 1527, Florentine citizens, encouraged by the sack of Rome, threw out the Medici and restored the Republic. Fearing for his life, he fled to Rome, leaving assistants to complete the Medici Chapel and Laurentian Library. In Rome, Michelangelo lived near the Church of Santa Maria di Loreto. It was at this time that he met the poet Vittoria Colonna. She was to become one of his closest friends until her death in 1547. In 1534, Pope Clement VII ordered, or let's say commissioned, Michelangelo another project. This time he was gonna paint a fresco of Last Judgment on the altar wall of Sistine Chapel. The fresco depicts the second coming of Christ and the Judgment Day. Michelangelo ignored the previous depiction of Jesus and he created a Jesus figure who is stronger, massive, without a beard, and naked. In the picture, Jesus is surrounded by saints, and Saint Bartholomew is holding a skin, actually a human skin, and the figure on that skin looks like Michelangelo a lot. So people say that this is his self-portrait. He looks very skinny in this picture, doesn't he? Sorry, I had to do it. Well, once completed, the depiction of Jesus Christ and Virgin Mary being naked was not liked by the church people. So they said that the fresco needs to be removed or concealed. But Pope said no, he liked it. But this was going to change in a few years. Keep watching, I will talk to you about it. Michelangelo had a complicated relationship with religion, but his spirituality deepened towards the end of his life. What he mourned mostly was his struggle with sin. His poetry includes the following closing lines from what is known as Poem 285. This was written in 1554. Neither painting nor sculpture will be able any longer to calm my soul. Now turn toward that divine love that opened his arms on the cross to take us in. Michelangelo was too moderate in his personal life and once told his apprentice Ascanio Condivi, "However rich I may have been, I have always lived like a poor man." Michelangelo's bank accounts and numerous deeds of purchase show that his net worth was about 50,000 gold ducats, which is about $7.5 million with today's currency. Condivi said he was indifferent to food and drink, eating more out of necessity than of pleasure, and that he often slept in his clothes and boots. He was by nature a solitary and melancholy person, bizzarro e fantastico, a man who withdrew himself from the company of men. The majority of his love poems date from the years when Michelangelo was in his 50s and 60s, and it is during this time that his struggle with his homosexuality is most pronounced. In the early 1530s, shortly after Michelangelo's move to Rome, he met a young man named Tommaso de' Cavalieri, to whom he dedicated numerous frustrated and intense poems and drawings of scenes from the classical poets of its writings and mythological love. The artist's poetic style resembles his visual work in energy, philosophical concerns, and its constant sensuality and abandon. Michelangelo's grandnephew, Michelangelo Buonarroti the Younger, published the poems in 1623 with the gender of pronouns changed, and it was not until John Addington Symonds translated them into English in 1893 that the original genders were restored. Remember Vittoria Colonna, the woman Michelangelo met in Rome in 1536? She was a noble widow and poet at the same time. Well, she and Michelangelo became really good friends, probably started a romantic relationship. They wrote poems to each other, and you can see how he loved her in his poetry. Actually, Colonna is the only woman, only female that Michelangelo had relationship with that we know of in his lifetime. But when Colonna died in 1547 at the age of 57, then Michelangelo's life crashed. He was devastated, and that was the time that he quit love poetry. In an attempt to reconcile his love of art and his religion, Michelangelo turned his attention almost exclusively to architectural projects in the service of the church. Of these, the most noteworthy was the design and construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The dome of this basilica, not completed until after his death, has been called by architect Bannister Fletcher as the greatest creation of Renaissance. Ironically, during this dark period of Michelangelo, he was at the height of his fame. In 1550, Vasari published the first edition of Michelangelo's biography in his Lives of the Artist, and Condivi published his more accurate Life of Michelangelo book in 1553. In 1547, after his best friend's or companion's death, maybe he started thinking about his own death. So he started this sculpture for his own tomb, Florentine Pieta. But his faithful assistant Francesco Urbino died in the process, and that threw him off. He took a hammer and he smashed his sculpture into pieces. He was done. All the people that he loved was leaving him. And remember, he might have some abandonment issues. So difficult. I mean, he barely makes committed relationship with people, and the ones that he chose started to die. So sad. Well, his students later worked on this shattered sculpture, and they tried to kind of bring it together, but it still remains unfinished. His artistic output in the last years of his life consists of a number of architectural and religious drawings, many of the Crucifixion and 2 final Pietas. Their rough and unfinished states may be partly intentional, and they are certainly more emotionally expressive because of their roughness. Michelangelo began both Palestina Pieta and Rondanini Pieta in 1556, when he was already in his 80s, negatively affected by illnesses, including kidney stones and ear problems, and by the constant interference of various officials and bureaucrats. Michelangelo spent most of his late years profoundly unhappy and lonely. After the 1563 Council of Trent prohibited the use of nude images in religious art, Michelangelo's student Daniel de Volterra was hired to paint drapery over much of the nudity in the Last Judgment. Daunted and exhausted, Michelangelo worked tirelessly until his death, trying in vain to compensate for his diminishing power. In 1564, Michelangelo got really ill all of a sudden. Some people say that he got soaked in a rainy day, and after that he caught fever. Just 2 days later, after he got sick, on Valentine's Day, February 14th, he closed his eyes for eternity. In his deathbed, there was 2 of his best friends, and one of them was the one he wrote love poems for, Tommaso de Cavalieri. He was buried in Florence, in Croce, in March, and his commemorative service was in July. Huge crowds gathered to say goodbye to him. The huge service in San Lorenzo shows that he was loved, if not personally, by his art and his work and his dedication. He did not have a very likable personality, and he did not like people. In a letter from late 1542, Michelangelo blamed the tensions between Julius II and himself on the envy of Bramante and Raphael, if you remember. He says for Raphael, all Raphael had in art he got from me. There was another feud between Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. So one day, as Leonardo da Vinci and his friend Giovanni di Giovina was passing the public benches at the Palazzo Spiniferroni near Florence's Church of Santa Trinita, some men were debating a passage in Dante. They called out to Leonardo, asking him to explain the passage for them. By chance, Michelangelo happened to passing too, and one of them hailed him. At this, Leonardo declared, "Michelangelo will be able to explain it for you." Michelangelo assumed this was said to entrap him, causing him to reply, "No, you explain, you who have undertaken the design of a horse to be cast in bronze, but were unable to cast it and were forced to give up in shame." So saying, he turned his back on them and began to depart. Leonardo remained, blushing at these words. I believe what made him so grumpy and lonely was the fact that his mother was never there, because she was sick, and after that she died when he was only 6 years old. Who looked after him was his nanny. Also, his father was irresponsible and was never there. Feeling abandoned by his parents, not wanted by his parents, probably he had some self-worth issues. Maybe that's why he was not bathing, he was not changing clothes, he was sleeping in his clothes and boots, and he was not spending any money on himself because he thought he was not worth it. He didn't deserve it. Maybe. And the fact that it is hard for him to build trustable relationships, it's hard to build trust for him because the children who had abandonment issues in their past have these kinds of problems. So I think being a perfectionist and having the control over his sculptures and his paintings, he felt calm and he felt focused. So he felt much better. Art gave him joy, a reason to live, and it could never abandon him. When it comes to supporting mechanism, I think the Medici family, especially Lorenzo Medici, supported him a lot, both financially and spiritually. As I said in the very beginning, he was a prodigy with artistic genius who lived really poorly in wealth, and he was lonely too. So we are thinking that maybe this is what people mean when they say money doesn't bring happiness necessarily. Don't you think? I'll see you in my next video in Artist Spotlight right here. Bye.